Imagine I ask you about the person responsible for the most deaths in history. You might think of Caesar, Genghis Khan, Hitler, Stalin, or one of the many war leaders throughout human history. But I don't think you'd guess that the real answer is actually a chemist. This person is responsible for more deaths than anyone else in history. This man may have even caused the deaths of people you know, and it's likely that he's also to blame for lowering the IQ of you, your siblings, your family, and everyone you know. Maybe today you could have been a nuclear scientist if this guy hadn't existed. So, how did he cause all these problems? That's what we're going to find out in today's story. Hey everyone, this is Shamsuddin. So, let's dive in without further delay. In 1908, the automobile industry was just getting started. Back then, people used a crank to start their car engines. The crank was basically a metal rod that you had to manually turn to get the engine running. That year, there was a woman driving her car on one of Michigan's bridges, and her car suddenly stopped in the middle of the bridge. Another driver stopped to help her. He got out of his car, grabbed the crank, and started trying to turn her engine over. He cranked and cranked with all his strength, and suddenly, the engine roared to life. The engine started up so fast and violently that the crank flew around and hit the man in the face, breaking his jaw. Unfortunately, the injury was so severe that it led to his death. That man was Byron Carter, the owner of a car company. His death deeply affected many of his friends, one of whom was Henry Leland, the founder of the famous Cadillac Company. Henry Leland was devastated by how his friend had died and was determined to invent a new way to start car engines without using the crank. Finally, after a lot of trials and experiments, in 1911, they succeeded in creating the first car engine that could start on its own without a crank. This car was the Cadillac Model 30, and it was the most powerful and advanced car of that year. The demand for it was crazy. But there was one problem. The engine was incredibly loud, like deafening loud. This was because of the power and speed of the pistons compressing the fuel-air mixture inside the engine. I won't go into too much detail, but because the engine was so powerful, it compressed the fuel rapidly, causing irregular combustion or small explosions, leading to the loud knocking sound that made people's ears ring. This knocking wasn't just an annoying noise. It also caused problems in the engine and significantly weakened its performance. So, what was the solution? How could they fix this? After studying the issue, they discovered the fix wasn't in changing the engine itself, but in changing the fuel. They needed to create fuel that could handle higher levels of pressure. You know how when you go to the gas station, you see numbers like 91, 95, or 98? The higher the number, the more pressure the fuel can withstand. The fuel back then couldn't handle the high pressure produced by powerful engines, and that's why you'd hear that annoying knocking sound, which also made engines perform way worse. General Motors, which was and still is the biggest American car company and owns most of the car brands you know, assigned a chemist named Thomas Midgley the task of upgrading regular fuel to withstand higher pressure, essentially creating a new fuel compound that would solve the problem. Midgley tried every material you could imagine. He mixed fuel with aluminum, ethanol, ethylene, even butter and camphor. Dude tried everything. Unfortunately, most of the materials he experimented with didn't work and didn't fix the engine knocking problem, except for one. That material was ethanol. The problem was that the fuel needed a lot of ethanol to solve the engine knocking issue, and ethanol was expensive, so he had to find another cheap material that wouldn't require large amounts to modify the fuel. Then, Midgley tried a new material called tellurium, and this mixture worked great. It completely solved the engine knocking issue. But there was one big problem: the smell. The odor was so unbearable that even if you changed your clothes or showered, the stench would stick to you. Midgley's wife couldn't stand it, to the point that she made him sleep in the basement alone for 7 months. Midgley wrote in his journals that while this material could save the fuel industry, humanity just couldn't deal with the smell. Midgley kept experimenting in his lab for 5 years, and finally, in 1921, he thought he found the perfect solution. The substance Midgley discovered was tetraethyl lead. Earlier in his experiments, Midgley figured out that ethanol was an excellent solution to the problem, but the obstacle was that it was expensive and required large amounts. However, when he combined ethanol with lead, he managed to create a compound that produced fuel capable of handling high pressure, solved the engine knocking problem, and was cheap, available, and didn't have any bad smell. The perfect solution, right? Well, it would have been, except for the fact that lead is toxic. In one conversation with his boss at General Motors, Midgley said, "Imagine the amount of money we're going to make from this invention. We're looking at $200 million, easily, probably more." Just to put things in perspective, $200 million back then would be about $3 billion today. Due to his invention and new discovery, the American Chemical Society decided to award Midgley the Nichols Medal, which is considered a prestigious scientific award. They asked him to appear in public speeches and lectures to talk about his new discovery, but Midgley refused, and he will explain his reasons for this refusal shortly. The important thing is that after this smooth invention, a new company was founded, named Ethyl after the compound, and they completely ignored mentioning lead, even though the compound was originally more composed of lead than ethyl. But they knew that using lead would bring them negative publicity. So, all their marketing for the company and this new petroleum compound focused on the fact that it was made of ethyl, and they didn't talk about the lead it contained. This ethyl company was the result of cooperation between several car companies, headed by General Motors, along with huge oil companies in America. The company's simple goal was to market and sell this new and latest petroleum compound, the compound that would solve engine knocking problems and give cars much more power and quality than any other competitor. The marketing campaign run by this company was unmatched, and what helped them, of course, was that their product did what they claimed. It eliminated engine knocking, removed the annoying sound, and made the engine perform its full power without any problems. As Midgley and his friends at the company expected, the demand for their new petroleum compound was huge. To meet this demand, the Ethyl Company needed to build a large chemical plant in New Jersey. But the disasters of this new invention began to appear quickly. Within just 2 months, dozens of workers who worked in this plant fell victim to lead poisoning, and 5 of them died instantly. A negative view of this new petroleum compound began to form among people and the public. Even before these plant incidents, and since the founding of the Ethyl Company, many researchers and scientists at universities and prestigious institutions began speaking out against this new compound, reminding the public and the government that lead is a toxic substance. But the effectiveness of this new petroleum compound made people turn a blind eye to these warnings, and both companies and the government were happy with the profits that started flowing into their pockets like rain, and no one cared until the compound began to claim its first victims. As an attempt by the company to combat the negative perception that began to form around their new compound, Midgley himself held a press conference, brought a mixture of their new substance, ethyl lead, and began inhaling it in front of them for a full minute, claiming that he could do this daily without being harmed. But in reality, Midgley knew the dangers of this substance, and that's why he refused to give any public speeches or lectures about the new compound he invented, the compound that earned him a big scientific award. He knew that if any scientist or researcher asked him about the lead in the compound and the dangers of poisoning from it, he wouldn't be able to answer. In fact, Midgley knew how dangerous this substance was because, from the very beginning of the experiments on this compound, he had been exposed to lead poisoning himself. He spent almost an entire year in 1923 on sick leave recovering from the poisoning he experienced after the experiment he conducted in Florida. So just imagine the greed that drives someone who is supposed to be a scientist to release a dangerous substance like this just because it would make him rich, even though he didn't want to get near it himself. And while he was inhaling this toxic substance for a minute in front of people at the conference, he knew it was poisonous, but he also knew that the amount was small, and inhaling it for a minute wouldn't be enough to cause lasting damage or kill him. Lead is extremely toxic and dangerous to living organisms. When it enters the body, it gets trapped in the bones and stays there, potentially poisoning the body for decades. Among the most affected parts of the body by lead are the bones and the brain. Some of the many symptoms of lead poisoning include constant headaches, memory loss, and numbness in the fingertips. The worst part is that children are the most vulnerable to lead poisoning. From a young age, lead can reduce their focus and IQ, leading to slower learning and behavioral issues. The problem is that the dangers of lead have been known for hundreds of years, and scientists and researchers consider this basic knowledge. Lead is a toxic and dangerous substance that should not be used in anything that's used daily, especially in something that releases gases everywhere, like gasoline. As we said, from the moment this compound appeared, many scientists and researchers warned against it. But where's the power? The power is with those who have money. When car and oil companies, the most powerful companies in the world, discovered this new gold mine, there was no way they were going to give it up. So, these companies hired scientists and researchers to conduct studies supporting the use of the new petroleum compound. The response of these studies to the issue that lead is toxic and dangerous was that the amount used in the new compound was small and wouldn't cause much harm. They also wrote in their studies that lead is naturally present in the earth, and the new compound wouldn't significantly affect lead levels in the atmosphere. And this debate went on for decades, while the companies were making massive profits from leaded gasoline. This type of gasoline spread all over the world, and every country started using it. There wasn't a lot of public concern about it, even though there were demands to ban this gasoline. But the president of Standard Oil, Frank Howard, at that time literally said, "We don't feel it's fair to give up a gift that came to our industry from heaven. Why give it up based on the possibility of a small harm that might come from it? We can't do that." And of course, if oil companies want something, they'll get it, because oil is money, and money is power and authority. The oil companies wanted leaded gasoline, and leaded gasoline spread to every corner of the earth. And like we said, the debate over this type of gasoline went on for decades. One camp of scientists said that lead levels in the world were normal and natural, and that this gasoline wasn't affecting them. The other camp of scientists said no, lead levels are rising at a scary rate, and these materials, especially this gasoline, need to be banned. One of the famous scientists who conducted several experiments on lead levels was a guy named Claire Patterson. Patterson took samples from ancient mummies of people who lived thousands of years ago, mummies from Egypt and mummies from Mexico, and compared them to the lead levels in the bones of recently deceased Americans. Patterson expected the lead levels in the bones of recently deceased people to be maybe 100 times higher than the lead levels in the mummy's bones. But the result was shocking. The lead levels were 1,000 times higher. So just imagine the impact that modern industries and the compounds using this toxic substance had, especially the petroleum compound that Midgley invented. The studies on the effects of lead toxicity on humans were absolutely terrifying. The impact of lead on human intelligence was scary and horrifying in every sense of the word. Your intelligence and focus today might actually be lower just because of this gasoline that Midgley invented and that spread across the globe. When I read this information, I was actually happy, because now I have an excuse to tell my teacher if I don't finish my homework. I'll tell him my limited intelligence couldn't solve it because of the lead I inhaled yesterday. Anyway, let's get back to the point. The studies showed that children with higher levels of lead in their bodies are much more likely to fail in school. Research says that lead poisoning is responsible for 30% of learning disabilities worldwide. Studies also say that lead poisoning is responsible for the loss of over 800 million IQ points globally. To put that into perspective, the average person's IQ is around 100 points. So imagine 800 million points lost just because of lead poisoning. The disaster doesn't stop there. There are also studies that show a direct correlation between crime rates and lead poisoning in several countries, which makes a lot of sense. If general intelligence levels drop, crime rates are definitely going to rise. Of course, not all crimes are caused by lead poisoning, but it's clear there's a correlation. Okay, let's set aside IQ, crime, and all that, and look at the direct deaths caused by lead poisoning. Research estimates that over the past century, lead poisoning has caused the death of between 80 to 100 million people worldwide. Most of these people died from heart disease and atherosclerosis caused by this type of poisoning. So just imagine, all these disasters from lowering human intelligence to the deaths of tens of millions of people were all because of Midgley and his invention of this compound, even though he knew how much harm it could cause. And all this, for what? For wealth and money. And where did all that wealth and money lead him? Let me tell you. In 1940, when Midgley was 51 years old, he got polio, which left him physically disabled and barely able to move. To help him get out of bed, he invented a mechanical bed with pulleys and ropes to make it easier for him to stand up. But in 1944, while using that bed, he made a wrong move, and the ropes got tangled around his neck, strangling him to death. A destructive invention like leaded gasoline started being banned by countries around the world in the 1980s. Japan was the first country to ban it in 1986, followed gradually by the rest of the world. Algeria was the last country to ban it just last year, in 2021. It's terrifying when you think about these things and realize the disasters one person or a small group of people can cause, despite all the advancements science has made today. The scariest part is when governments, countries, and big companies ignore a massive and obvious disaster just for money and wealth. It's really scary, really scary. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.